All right, welcome to everyone joining. We're going to start in about 3 minutes. And as is tradition for these CE events, if you want to put in the chat box where you're coming in from, that would be great. Always good to see what representation we have across the US for these.
Aaron, I can't seem to change your name, man.
That's okay. I'll be you for today.
I was like, how can I change his name? I think it's on the back end. All right, let me see match appearance.
All right, we're going to start in about 2 minutes. Thank you everyone for joining us on this Sunday morning. And feel free to leave in the chat where you're coming from, where you're watching this video from. That would be fantastic. Pasadena, there we go.
Yeah, let's go, Irvine.
Memphis. SCO, there we go. Irvine, got a lot of SoCal represented today.
Yeah.
Rockville, Spartanburg. Good old Houston. For some reason, Chris Lopez thinks that's the best optometry school. I don't know why.
Hands down. No question, no doubt about it.
New York, El Paso, got a lot of Texas represented. Awesome. Because it is. There we go. Jason Lamb from ODs on Corporate. Welcome, Jason, and all the ODs on Corporate group. All right, we're going to give it about 1 more minute for everyone to file in, and then we'll get started. And if you haven't, leave in the comments where you're watching from. And keep in mind that this is all interactive, so when you have questions, when Chris starts his presentation, feel free to leave them in the Q&A or the chat, and he will be answering as he goes along. And we'll mention that once again before we get started. Connecticut, nice.
Call it spring.
Some people are driving and watching this.
Oh, nice.
Drive safely.
Safe guys.
That doesn't say something about technology that you can get CE while you're driving.
So you're driving. Sacramento, it's hot out there right now.
It's hot in the Bay Area right now.
Wow. Yeah.
Canada, there we go. We're international now.
Officially international.
Alberta, got a couple. Oh.
All right.
All right, awesome. Well, I know that people are still filing in here, and that's going to probably happen for the next 10 to 30 minutes, but we're going to go ahead and get started so we stay on schedule. Want to welcome everyone. It's been about a month since we did our last CE event, so welcome. Thanks for joining us on an early Sunday morning, or if you're on the East Coast, Sunday afternoon. And just a few quick announcements before we jump into the program. Number one, you may have heard ODsonFinance Careers has officially launched. We're super excited, and we can't thank everyone enough for the support that we've got for the past couple of weeks that we've launched this thing. There are quite a few jobs up there. There's also a few practices that are listed, and many have created their profiles. So if you haven't already, you can create your profile for free. It's just like LinkedIn. Your profile has your picture, it has everything about you, it has your whole profile. So just do it. Even if you're not actively looking for a job, it's good to be on there. And if you are looking for an OD, an associate, or anything like that, you can post that job. It's $19 a month. We're not trying to nickel and dime you like every other website out there. We're simply trying to make it easy so that optometry can thrive. And we've got this network of 15,000 ODs and ODsonFinance for you to take from. So definitely utilize it. And if you're selling your practice, $2.99 a month to list your practice. We don't have any brokerage fees, and we do have consultants that can help you in the process. Everything's a la carte. We're not trying to take 6% of your sale price. That's not how we do things here. We're trying to keep it simple and have it work for you, because we want to advance the profession. That's the whole point of this. So scan that QR code if you're interested. And our second announcement is our team up, and we've done this for quite a while with CSI. I personally have used CSI for 7 years in my private practice ownership journey, and they've been fantastic for billing services, compliance, credentialing, and chart review. So I'm going to pass it over to Rob, who is our first sponsor, and he's going to talk a little bit more about CSI and what they can bring to the table for your practice.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you, Dad. Really appreciate the partnership that we have created, and speaking to your members focused on finance is really what we want to do at CSI and help you with. Specifically when you're looking at outsourcing your billing. I think CSI has been committed to doctors of optometry for many years. We really help on the procedure side of the bill of your business and help you become compliant and profitable. And we manage your billing operations and ideally letting you focus on patient care. So many things in the world have changed since this pandemic came to be, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to navigate. When we partner with you, we're hoping that we can help you focus on the revenue generating functions of the business. Our third-party requirements have become just increasingly more difficult for you to get paid for the services that you're doing. And unfortunately, there's little guidance or anywhere to assist you in receiving continuing education or keeping up with the new regulations. And so our speaker today, these are part of it, but unfortunately, there's so many pieces that maybe our payers are unwilling to help in some situations, you know, and if you're not refiling in time, or you don't get paid. The amount of time and money and effort that's required to be paid by, you know, our third-party payers, it's difficult and difficult for one individual in your office to be responsible for. So when we take over your billing, CSI's role really begins at the patient encounter, and we kind of pick it up from there. We're fulfilling the billing component of your medical insurance claim. We scrub that claim on an ICD-10 and a CPT level. We're batching and we're submitting those claims and posting your vision and medical claims in your software and utilizing your clearinghouse. We track those claims to completion. We're monitoring and working claim rejections and denials. We notify your office if there is an action step that's needed to reprocess that claim. We make those corrections and then we reprocess it. We really are looking at your ERAs, and then we post your medical and your vision payments in your practice management system. We really look at it like compliance does equal profitability. And there are many offices out there that are unintentionally leaving reimbursements on the table. And how much or how often they're difficult questions to answer. And so we offer through ODsonFinance a complimentary review of your information and really identify, are you putting up audit red flags? Is there money being left on the table? We want to help you identify those areas, and ideally, if there is money being left on the table, it typically means that something's not being done compliantly, and really looking at assuring that you get paid for the work you do. And so it's a little background on CSI. My contact information is there. If there's any questions you have, there's also an Ask CSI button that is on the ODsonFinance website. So if you have denial you can't figure out or something's going on, it's a complimentary service through our partnership with ODsonFinance. Please take advantage of that. Send us in what you're seeing or what's not making sense, and someone will get back to you within 24 hours and hopefully give you some guidance and assist in those areas. But again, thank you, Dat, Aaron, Julie. Our partnership is amazing, and we really appreciate everything you've done for us.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rob. That was a fantastic presentation. And once again, yeah, I don't know how I would run my practice without CSI. It's always been an integral part ever since I took ownership. So they're fantastic, a great way to just make yourself more efficient and make yourself more profitable. So feel free to scan that QR code there. And just a quick side note, if you ever see John or Rob at any sort of convention, grab a drink with them. They're pretty cool people to hang out with.
Well, there you go. I'm buying.
Too much fun.
Yeah. All right. And then let's move on to our next sponsor, and that's Michael Relvis Insurance Consultants. Insurance can be simple with the right advocate to help objectively compare and understand your options. And Michael is here to show you how to do that. So, Michael, I'll let you take the floor.
Thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Relvis. I'm a certified financial planner professional. I focus very specifically on life insurance and disability insurance. I've been doing this for about probably 16 or 17 years now. I've got a pretty good amount of experience. I've worked with a lot of ODs and have really enjoyed it. In fact, I've been a proud sponsor really, of the ODsonFinance blog and Facebook group and just the community in general. I've sort of always thought to myself that optometrists are this group of professionals that really need a lot of support and just don't get it. There's not a ton of it out there. And so as soon as I found out about ODsonFinance, I kind of jumped on that pretty quick. It was a great thing to get behind. So I'm also happy to help sponsor this event, and hopefully everybody gets something out of this. So I won't take up too much time. I just wanted to give a quick introduction about myself. So term life, disability insurance, these are pretty boring topics, obviously, but very important topics nonetheless. Disability insurance is a type of insurance that helps to replace a paycheck if we are too sick or too injured to work. Obviously, if there's no paycheck, there's no ability to pay bills, put food on the table, take care of dependents, all of that stuff. There's also no way to continue to pay for lease expenses, equipment expenses, and really maintain a business. With life insurance, kind of very similar. We're talking about protecting our dependents, of course, but also protecting our business interests. And I think this is one of the things that I really have enjoyed most about working with optometrists over the years is there is a pretty big need and on a personal level, but also a lot on a business level. I work with a lot of medical professionals, physicians, dentists, optometrists, and optometrists by far are the group that are most commonly self-employed in some way. So that's either set up as independent contractors or running their own practice, running joint practices. And even when they're set up as W-2s with an existing practice or organization, a lot of times they're not provided benefits. And these things are topics and financial products that a lot of people do get from their employer. Some still get supplemental private coverage beyond that. But optometrists are a group of people that really aren't provided these things as benefits. And so if you don't get it yourself, unfortunately, you just don't have it, which obviously leaves a pretty big opening for just a financial catastrophe. So we really enjoy working with optometrists. My intent and my sort of business strategy has always been to be very truthful, very transparent, very objective. Absolutely no sales pressure. If anything, feels very awkward to me. So if anything, the conversations that I have with people are very open, very personable, just to educate, give people information. You are all very intelligent individuals. You can make your own decisions, obviously. So I'm just here to educate you and give you the information you don't have so that you can make those decisions. I put together a little PDF here that I'm happy to email after. These are just ballpark figures in case somebody's first question is, well, how much does this cost? This gives you a little bit of that information. I added some disclosures on here, but this is not specific to any one company. We do work with several companies. This is just ballpark figures, average. It'll give you something that's pretty close to what you could expect. Disability and life insurance pricing can be impacted by a lot of variables. So again, I didn't want to get too specific on this. I think everybody's situation is a little bit unique. I'm happy to help whoever is interested. Aaron will provide my contact information and all that. So, and if anybody has any questions, of course, the chat box is open as well. I'm happy to at least provide some open-ended questions there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael. So once again, QR code's right there. That jumps to his landing page. Fantastic resource for both disability and term life insurance. Notice that says term life and not whole life. So,
yes.
So he's a fantastic resource, and he definitely has helped out a lot of our community. And Dad mentioned in the chat, he was actually one of our very first sponsors back in 2017. So it's good to see him on again. So Michael, thank you.
Absolutely. I hope everybody enjoys. Thanks for being here.
All right, great. And then one more quick announcement that Julie wanted me to put in here. The eye care tonometer group buy, we've done fantastic. I think there's over 50 people that are interested. So look at these prices right here. Should be the best out there at this point, especially with the rebates and then the probes that you get with it as well, and a free stand as well. Oh, I didn't even know that. Okay, so yeah, make sure to check that out. You can email Brian Goodwin for more information. Also on the Facebook group, we've got that post there, so make sure to comment on it and fill out the Google Sheet so that you can be part of this. And it's going to end on July 20th, so it is time sensitive, so make sure you get one. And yeah, great addition to your practice for checking in IOPs. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the co-approved CE portion of this presentation. One thing to note before we get started, before I go through all these reminders, we will have a raffle at the very end of this for $100 Amazon gift cards, so make sure to stay for that. There's going to be one lucky winner. A few things. Make sure to answer any live poll questions. I'm not sure if we'll actually have any, but if we do, we might have to put them in the chat, so make sure to complete those. There's going to be a survey afterwards. It gets sent to you once you log off of Zoom. Make sure to fill that out. That gives us great feedback for both our speaker and how we did today. You need to be present during the entirety of each hour to receive CE credit. Zoom tracks your presence, so make sure that you're just logged on. If you have any connectivity issues, contact us at at ODsonFinance.com. And finally, CE certificates are going to be sent out in about 3 to 4 weeks after the event. And so I'm going to do a quick introduction here for Dr. Chris Wolfe. He's going to be talking to us for the next 2 hours on everything we always wanted to know about optic nerve disease and the billing and coding aspects of that. Dr. Wolfe has a passion for education. He is a co-founder of KMK Board Certification Review Services, a company specializing in preparing doctors of optometry to take American Board of Optometry examinations. He's the founder of iCode Education, a company specializing in clinical and billing education. He's also the co-author of the book KMK Optometry Board Certification Review Manual and KMK Update and iCode Billing and Coding. Dr. Wolfe is a fellow in the American Academy of Optometry and a diplomat of the American Board of Optometry. He also has special interest in therapeutic scleral contact lenses to correct visual distortions in patients with corneal diseases. And one other note, I was at Vision Source Exchange about a month ago, and what I learned at Vision Source Exchange when I talked to about probably 100 doctors there is Chris Wolfe is the smartest OD in Vision Source. That was the universal acclaim for him. So I just wanted to embarrass him a little bit before we get started. But otherwise, Chris, I'm going to let you take over. It's going to be a 2-hour presentation. Feel free to put questions in the comments and in the Q&A. Chris Lopez is going to be moderating those, and Chris is going to try to answer those as he goes through his presentation to keep this engaging as possible. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Aaron. Thanks for the embarrassment. I don't know if you were there, but at the exchange, I was actually had the honor and pleasure to share the stage with Carrie Walsh Jennings. And if you don't remember who she is, she's a 3-time gold medalist in the Olympics. And I was giving her a little bit of a hard time at the very beginning. And I said, so she has not worn her medals since she won them. And but she was like, well, you can wear them. And I was like, oh, I can't wear your medals if you won't wear them, but okay, I'll wear them. And so I came out with a medal on, and I was kind of giving her a little bit of a hard time just to lighten the conversation. And I said, so when you wear a gold medal, are you supposed to do this, brush off your shoulder and throw up your hands? And she goes, no, put your hands, thanks to God, and prayer hands. And I thought, holy cow, like that was awesome. Like it was just an awesome, you brought up, I don't think that I'm the smartest guy in Vision Source, but I can definitely have fun with that. So I really appreciate that. And she threw it right back at me, and I was not expecting her to be able to say that right that quick. So it was humbling and a great learning lesson for me from her about how to handle pretty big success, which is pretty awesome that she's had. So anyway, today, we're going to talk about total patient care and utilizing technology to manage optic nerve disease and posterior segment diseases. And what we're calling this is Billing and Coding 101, and everything you want to know in terms of optic nerve head disease. I'll tell you though, Aaron, as we get started here, I think it's really important first to see my disclosures. My financial disclosures are such, and I think it's important that you not only see who I've consulted for, but but how much I've made for those from those companies. I'm also an owner of iCode Education. I'm the sole owner of iCode Education, and I'm also a founder of a company called Peak. So I won't mention, besides that, I don't think I'm going to mention anything else in here that I have other interest in. And I don't think I'm going to really mention any of those other things there. But I think the point is that to me, it's important to show you this for two reasons. The first is not just so you can see a whole big laundry list of people that I've consulted for or gotten honoraria from, but also so that you can see if it makes a difference to you that Sight Science paid me $8,300 to evaluate a potential mechanism for payment on TearCare, then you should know that, right? You should know if I'm going to talk about TearCare, then you should know that I might have a potential bias that $8,300 can sway me one of the other ways. The other thing you should know is that the second reason I do this, and it's probably the primary reason I do it, is because if a company asks me to do something for them, or if I want to have a partnership with a company, and I'm going to do a COPE talk, I want to be able to say that this is a company that I think is doing okay, doing good things. And so here's a company that I've worked for in the past. So in any case, those are my financial disclosures. This is a QR code that will dump you into open payments data. And I think it's helpful to open payments people when I hear them talk, because I think I want to know, I want to know what potential conflicts they have. So we're going to talk a couple things. And Aaron, as you had talked before, and Dat did as well, is that if there are questions that come up, if I don't explain something well, please let me know. We're going to talk about the technological and financial aspects of managing posterior segment disease and optic nerve disease. And these are the conditions that we're going to primarily discuss. And so a lot of them, I'll try to wrap up sort of the clinical nuances of those conditions, as well as the billing and coding nuances. But more importantly, as far as billing and coding is concerned, and Rob really pointed this out at the beginning, and I couldn't agree with him more, is to say that I really believe foundationally that we as optometrists will manage diseases more, not because they pay us well, but we'll manage the diseases more when we understand the revenue cycle. And so that's really where I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about today in terms of amplifying things. We're not going to be talking a ton, although I can answer questions on specific codes that we might use in a specific encounter. What I think is more important is to say, okay, well, if we take this patient who I am able to keep in my practice because of my knowledge, education, and training, and that patient needs that specific level of care, and I follow a clinical practice guideline, then I can know that is worth some sort of value over time. And so we're going to spend the first part of this talk really just talking about what that value is. And some of it you may have heard me talk in bits and pieces, but I think it's appropriate to get us in the right frame of mind to understand why we think about optic nerve disease and posterior segment disease in one specific way. The other thing to know is that we will be talking about kind of the financial aspects of providing care, but I want you to know that deep down, my belief is just like Aaron and Dat were discussing before, is that my primary purpose is to serve patient needs, is I want to serve the patients. And so anytime we talk about the financial aspects of serving patients, sometimes it can feel sort of weird. And I do think that even with optometrists, and especially with optometrists, we feel very uncomfortable with those conversations, although those conversations generally make us frustrated when we don't have a good command of them. And so while we will talk about the kind of the practice revenue portion, the reason that I think that that's so important is that if we don't have a really strong understanding of the revenue cycle that occurs when we manage optic nerve disease or macular disease or retinal disease, and we just sort of think, I do this because it's sort of what I was trained to do, but it's as opposed to it's what I was trained to do. I'm the best person to be able to do this for my patients, and it's profitable for my practice. If I just sort of don't think that it's profitable for my practice, it's not that I won't take care of those patients. It's almost that you won't see as much value in taking care of those patients because you're comfortable with the other value revenue generators that you'll have in your practice. And so you may be more likely to underutilize your knowledge, education, and training for patients. So what I like to do in this, Aaron, is I like to basically say, okay, we're going to take all of that and take it off the table. If I can prove to you that those services are worth your time doing based on your current revenue, then you don't ever have to wonder when a patient comes in with flashes and floaters if it was worth your time to care for them as opposed to just sending them out the door and referring them to somebody else or whatever other optic nerve condition. And that's the primary reason that I talk about the revenue cycle. It is not because it is profitable to practice. It's because I talk about that because if I can tell you that it's profitable to practice and I can convince you and show you that that's true, then you're going to take better care of your patients and you're going to be able to utilize those clinical practice guidelines and our training so much better. I see that time and time again when I work with other practices across the country. And so I think that's really important because I think if I'm self-aware, I can come off with this idea that all I care about is the financial bottom dollar. And it is completely the opposite. It's removing that barrier to my subconscious and optometrist subconscious to say, if we remove that barrier because we understand it's valuable and we understand it's a revenue generator, then we can take care of the patient because we don't have to worry about spending other time doing other things. And so this is one really important reason that that we've got to think about it. And I have done this. I've talked about this on other webinars as well. And I may have mentioned it last December when we did this before, but these services are in demand and they are, and when we think about the increase in the need for medical types of services in eye care, between 2020 and 2030, there is an estimate that there's going to be an increased demand by 21%. Routine services are going to increase, but it's about 2%. And I will tell you that I'm not even talking about it here, but when you look at the amount of just cataract surgery, ophthalmology can't handle this increase in medical service need, and they certainly can barely handle the increased need, and maybe they can't increased need for cataract surgery as well. So when you look at who's going to be available to provide these suite of services, it has to be optometrists. If it's not optometrists, it's going to be nurse practitioners or physician assistants. And they are clearly not as well trained as we are to provide the services that we're talking about here. So again, another reason to embrace that is because that is the future of the profession. Now, again, when we think about the future of the profession, one of the things that we have to be aware of is this idea of stagnant reimbursements. And so when we think about, if I've gotten a raise from any payers, it is not from my managed vision care payers, it is from my medical payers. And so, can you get increases in pay from your managed vision care? Yes, there's ways to negotiate that in certain population centers, in probably most population centers, it's going to be really challenging to do. But this slide, I think, is really helpful. One, because it spans my entire professional career. We could go back further, but if you look at 2008 into 2022, what I did on this slide was to do a couple things. First is to say, if I was taking a reimbursement of $65 that I was really happy with in 2008, in 2022, if we just look at inflammation, if we look at inflation over that 14-year period, what you'll see, and you can see inflection points here, because what I did was I went back and looked at all of this specific inflation year over year. And some years were relatively flat, some years were relatively steep. This does not even account in 2022. When I built this slide, it does not even account for the 8 to 10% inflation that we're experiencing right now. It just assumed that from 2021 all the way up until 2030, we're going to have sort of this linear inflation that was average. It was the average of what we had in the first 14 years of my practice. The bottom line from that is that when I look at that difference, what that means is in order to have as much buying power as I had in 2008 from providing one managed vision care exam, I would have to be reimbursed over $80 for that same exam. And by the time 2030 comes in, it's going to be over $95 per exam. And yet most of us don't expect that those fees are going to be increased in any significant way over that period of time. So what that means is, I'm not going to really get into the details of hiring better and how do we pay our people and incentivize them in ways. These are things that I've talked about, and Aaron, you and I have talked about even on the podcast, but I'm not even going to get into that today. What I'm going to get into is just the idea of considering what is driving that patient in, and what is our value for the thing that patient needs today. And then anything else that patient might need over time, does it fit into the box that we're doing today, or is it something else that deserves more time and attention for that patient at some other visit? And that's where we can say, okay, well, maybe we can shrink this down, where in order to offset the cost of inflation in my practice, I'm not saying this is what we've done, I'm just throwing it out there, is that now I've got to be, if I'm getting compensated $65 for that comprehensive managed vision care plan, or comprehensive eye exam under a managed vision care plan, but now it basically has the same buying power I would need, the buying power of over $80. Well, I've got to figure out a way to basically be more efficient by approximately 30%. So instead of seeing a patient every 30 minutes, I probably need to see a patient 3 times an hour, right? Instead of twice an hour. So to generate the same revenue that otherwise would have been generated. And so those are things that you could think about in your practice if you want to continue to provide managed vision care. The other thing that I think is really helpful is if you're going to provide a lot of managed vision care and grow your practice, how do we know where it stops and then where the next thing is? And so, we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through here, but that's why it's so important. And so I wanted to start about talking about optic nerve disease from a standpoint of thinking about this as the classic traditional optometric model, where we sort of have this comprehensive eye exam, and we're happy taking the comprehensive eye exam if we can sell a pair of glasses or sell an annual supply of contacts. Those are sort of our revenue generators, where we know that the annual eye exam may be sort of a marketing expense or a loss leader, but if we can sell that patient something else, then it makes it worth it to us to take those managed vision care plans. But then when we think about chronic ocular disease, and when I say chronic ocular disease, I say, what makes you uncomfortable? Is there a patient's chief complaint or a clinical finding that you see within a patient that makes you clinically less comfortable, that makes you question, I wonder what this patient's risk is over time? Well, how we manage that risk or that patient symptom or the chronic ocular disease really is going to come to impact the way that our practice is built over time. So the question I ask is, am I managing chronic ocular disease in a positive way to the practice and to the patient? Am I managing it in a neutral way or a detrimental way? So one way is that if it's beneficial to the practice, then that is generating that patient back into the practice for another annual routine exam, and for us to evaluate something else and putting them back into this idea of being able to manage that ocular disease. And specifically today, we'll talk about posterior segment and optic nerve disease. And so that patient, comes back into seeing them. However, if we refer this patient out to somebody else that we feel has a better understanding of the revenue cycle or the billing cycle, or we feel like they have a better, and I think if you think that they're the better person to manage it, then you should let them manage it. But the point is that if we're referring this out to somebody else, at best, they're going to generate the revenue from this chronic ocular disease management, and then they might send them back to us for their annual routine exams. In the worst case scenario is that it could be detrimental, where we send it out to somebody else, and then now that somebody else is not only taking care of their chronic ocular disease, but they're not even sending them back to you for the comprehensive care. So your referrals, your patterns really make a huge impact, and it's something we ought to be considering in terms of how we're going to approach a patient. Now, many of you have probably heard me talk about the idea of a total patient care model. And the reason, again, I do that is to show you that every single need that a patient has in our practice probably has a financial pillar for the practice as well. So when a patient has a need, symptom or sign, that patient, if you're managing that patient under our clinical practice guidelines, that will become a pillar. And it's not a mystery to wonder about what the revenue cycle is when we manage patients with glaucoma or optic nerve disease or macular degeneration or dry eye. Just like it's not really a mystery about what happens when that patient buys glasses. We can look at metrics all up and down. GPN does a ton of metrics. You can look at them at the MBA metrics, which we'll talk about here. And we can know that on average, if a patient the revenue that's generated from a patient who, based on 2018 data, it's about $350 per patient or so. If you provide a comprehensive eye exam, and that's about the revenue that's generated. So So the point is that you can know that, and you can know that for all of the other disease management. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is that when we take care of the patient, we will take care of the practice. And so to give you an overview, where I like to think about this is revenue per OD hour. And I'm not going to go into a bunch of details on revenue per OD hour, but Aaron, pause if you need me to, if there's questions about it, I'm happy to answer. But the reason that I like revenue, or Chris, I know Chris, you're monitoring as well, but the reason I like this is because it gives me a stepping point to compare apples to oranges. When I meet with doctors and when I work with practices, I commonly get the response that I know that if I see a patient for a comprehensive eye exam, managed vision care, and I sell them glasses or contact lenses, I know I'm going to generate X amount of dollars. And so I know I have the skills to provide these other services, like any other specialty services, anterior segment disease, posterior segment disease, office-based procedures. I know I have the skills to do that, but the amount of time it's going to take me to do that isn't going to be worth my time, because I could be seeing patients for, routine examination and then selling them glasses or contact lenses. Understanding your revenue per OD hour allows you to compare each one of those scenarios based on how much time you're dedicating to that specific service and how much revenue it's going to generate. And so when we look at this, in 2018 data, this is from MBA Metrics, the average independent practice across the country was going to generate $402 per hour. That's total revenue that the practice generates for the amount of time that the doctor is spending in the practice. Now, when I think about this number, it's probably a little higher now. I mean, I'd probably estimate there was 2019 numbers. 2020 numbers were kind of completely off in a lot of ways. So I would guess you're probably about 450 right now. On average, maybe a little bit less than that. So the calculation is easy. And I like this because you could actually do it right now. So you can calculate your revenue per OD hour by taking your gross revenue for some amount of time. We could just take the last year. So you could look at the last year divided by the number of weeks per year that you're seeing patients, divided by the number of days per week and the number of hours per day. And so if we took a practice that was doing $617,000, the doctor took a month off every year and saw patients 4 days a week and 8 hours a day, you're at $402 per OD hour. So that's our average, right? And so so I think that's a pretty easy way to calculate it. And it's something that should stick in the back of your mind, not because you necessarily have to compare yourself to $402 per OD hour, but because you can compare yourself to you, and then you can make judgments on, if I'm going to add managing optic nerve head disease and be more intentional about it in my practice. Okay, well, how does that compare? Is it more profitable? Is it less profitable? If it's less profitable, I'll tell you right now, if it's less profitable than generating $402 per OD hour, you're probably spending too much time with that patient, or you're undercoding or undercharging. I'll tell you, I mean, I think those are probably the two common scenarios that you would do that calculation for that specific service, and you'd be under that annual revenue. And the cool part about that is when you do that math, none of that means that you're selling patients glasses or contact lenses. So if I can look at providing a service that generates more than $402 per OD hour, or more than my average, then that doesn't even, anything that patient purchases in the practice then becomes an additional benefit to the practice. So if we look at additional revenue considerations, what I wanted to show you here is the idea of considering what we currently do. So let's look at routine examinations. And let's say we have a really good managed vision care plan. I did show you a slide of disclaimers, but what I want to show you here, or what I want to say specifically, is that I am not telling you what you should charge. I am not telling you what, any specific fees you should look at. You should determine your fees based on your specific practice. What I'm doing is kind of modeling out potential financial plans, and you could run these numbers yourself and decide what your fees might be. But let's say that we had a comprehensive or a managed vision care plan that would reimburse us $70 for an exam and refraction. And let's also say that we've incorporated some sort of retinal imaging in our practice, and that we charge $39 for that. That means that every exam that we do is for the professional services is $109. You can see how that extrapolates out for 2 exams per hour or 3 exams per hour. But now let's say that we're selling glasses. So now if I had 100% capture rate on retinal screening and 100% capture rate on eyeglass prescriptions, then the best I could do in this scenario would be, if I were seeing patients 3 exams per hour, it would be generating $1,227 per hour. And if you were doing that, and if you are doing that, you probably don't even care about the rest of my talk, other than to say, maybe we're going to talk about some of the nuances of optic nerve disease, because the reality is that's really great. But I will tell you that there are very few people, because we don't have 100% capture rate on any of those things. And we actually have a lot of empty slots in our schedule. We have a lot of time. Optometrists are notorious. Maybe notorious is not the right word, but the good part about optometry is that we spend a lot of time with our patients, and we get to know our patients. So we get to understand their preferences and their beliefs, and we take those into account. I'll tell you, our counterparts in medicine, right or wrong, don't do that. They will see probably twice the amount of patients on average as an optometrist will. Minimum, they're going to be seeing between 40 and 50, in most cases, 40 and 50 patients per day. If you look at the average of an optometric practice, you'd probably be between 15 and 30 patients a day for an optometric practice. And so I think that's a pretty fair assumption. And that does 2 things. First is that it allows them to see more bodies. They've got the infrastructure for that. But the other thing that it does to us is that we a lot of times think that we're more busy than we actually are. And so the data shows us that on average, we are seeing 1.2, this is 2018 data, but we're seeing 1.2 comprehensive eye exams per hour. And Aaron, if I were to ask you in your practice, and you don't have to answer now, you can if you want to, but if I were to ask you in your practice, how many exams per hour do you perform? What would you say if you want to? You might be on mute.
Yeah, on mute. For me, it's probably about 2.5 to 3, I would say.
Yeah, and so, but you would probably schedule 3 an hour. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so Aaron, what he did was what most of us don't do, is he already accounted for the fact that his schedule may not be completely full, or that patients are no-showing or rescheduling last minute, and you can't fill those slots. Most of us, what we would say is, I see 3 patients an hour. If I'm seeing 3 patients an hour, that's what I do. And so we forget the fact that those patients are not always showing up, and they're not always, those slots aren't always full. So the point I would make to Aaron is, well, Aaron, if you're seeing 2.5 patients per hour and you're estimating 3 is what you're scheduling for, then we could actually go through your practice and extrapolate that there's probably an extra 4 or 5 slots throughout your day that you have the ability to see more patients. And so maybe if it's the case that you're having patients drop off last minute, whether it's a no-show or reschedule within the last, let's say, 3 to 5 days before that appointment, then you might want to account for that and be able to build in additional slots to account for the fact that patients are going to last minute no show, and you can't bring them in. So you wind up having a full schedule. I'm sure you've already done that. The point is that, but what the reality is that the average practice, even the highest decile, is seeing 2 patients an hour. 2.2 patients an hour, the highest decile of independent practices. And what that translates into is, if they were only providing the routine exam and that patient isn't purchasing anything else in our practice, we're generating, basically on the lowest decile, which you can see right here, $62 an hour. On the highest decile, you're generating $237 per hour. And that's assuming they don't buy anything in your practice. And again, I'm just trying to provide perspective and clarity, so when we get into some of these other numbers, you can see how we get to there. But if you look at most chair costs per hour, they're right around $120 to $130 per hour. And so, if you're seeing the median, you're basically covering your chair costs with that exam. Now, if you sell that patient glasses, you can see how that extrapolates and can be pretty decent if those patients are all buying glasses every single time. So now let's sort of transition this into some cases. And we're going to start with cases that are, and I'll talk about the clinical aspects of those cases. And then what you'll see me do is I'm going to provide you with kind of the tools that we use for the primary case. So in this case, we'll start by talking about macular degeneration. And when we look at macular degeneration, and you see that there's all these tools that you have as far as opportunities in your practice to serve that patient. And then you have these additional services that you can provide. So remember that patients are entitled. I have a mentor, Bob Vandervoort, who practices in Omaha, and he always says, Chris, patients are entitled to more than one disease. And the reason he says that is because you don't want to be thinking glaucoma, 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 and then that patient has something else, right? So the point I'm making with patients that are entitled to more than one disease is that as patients age and they get macular degeneration, then the chance that they've got meibomian gland dysfunction and convergence deficiency, and the chances that they're going to get an anterior ischemic optic neuropathy, whether it's arteritic or non-arteritic, is going to present itself. And if we're going to be taking care of that patient's total patient care, then we have this opportunity to look at this patient as they had an annual comprehensive exam. We're managing them for macular degeneration, but over that period of time, we were also able to serve, retinal problems in their choroidal nevus, other optic nerve problems in their anterior ischemic optic neuropathy. We've been able to serve their dry eye problems, as well as their glasses and contact lens problems. And so what I'm going to talk about here when we get to the revenue cycle is, what was this patient worth to the practice in total for that specific time period? So what I actually did is, these are our cases of mine. These are patients of mine. I said, okay, well, let's look at an AM case. Let's look at an optic nerve case. And then I'll show, okay, how much of the service that I provided this patient was routine, quote unquote routine, how much of it was a specialty service, and how much of it was a medical service. So you can kind of see that broken down, and then we can compare that total patient value over a 3-year period to what our expectations are for revenue per OD hour. So I think that's kind of the approach that we'll take. So in any case, let's talk about macular degeneration specifically and the patient that we've been able to serve over time. So if we break down, and now some of these, some of the plan that you're seeing here can be modified based on your preference and your practice. But the first thing I want to do is I want to kind of talk about how we arrive at these different things. And so when we're thinking about what should we be doing for a patient, the first question is, how am I going to serve this patient best? And our clinical practice guidelines, the AOA's clinical practice guidelines, or the American Academy of Ophthalmology's preferred practice patterns, can give us a lot of guidance into what we ought to be doing. And then you can look to your evidence to sort of fill in the gaps that are kind of earlier or more advanced maybe than the clinical practice guidelines and the preferred practice patterns would suggest. But you can actually build out a sort of normal customary plan for your practice in a patient who has macular degeneration. And it's not really that challenging. You can say, look, I want to follow a protocol for most patients. And because I'm following a protocol, I'm going to order certain tests at certain times. If I'm really firing on all cylinders, what might work in my practice is to provide a comprehensive exam and think about what other services that patient might need at a comprehensive exam that can be done really efficiently. And if I can't do those services at the comprehensive exam really efficiently, then maybe I need to offload them to another exam, right? Or maybe I'm providing value that is outside of the managed vision care exam anyway. The point is you want to be intentional about it. And so you can break this down to say, okay, let's look at a patient who has category 2 macular degeneration. Well, as we all know, category 2 macular degeneration means that patient has drusen that are less than 125 microns. If you really get into the nuances of the Beckman classification, it would be larger than 63 microns to less than 125 microns. They don't have any significant pigment clumping. They don't have any geographic atrophy. So they're relatively low risk. If you look at the AREDS data 10 years after, their risk over the course of 10 years is about 1 in 200 to progress into advanced macular degeneration, either geographic atrophy or wet macular degeneration. So the risk is very low. You can have that conversation with the patient. But our clinical practice guidelines tell us that we should be providing some sort of macular evaluation on that patient. Now, our clinical practice guidelines also say that we should see that patient on an annual basis. Now, here's where the rub comes in when we talk about managed vision care versus comprehensive medical care and the conversation we want to have with each. If a patient comes in, and you can do one of two ways, Aaron, we can actually kind of have a deeper conversation about this. And I suspect, and I wouldn't disagree, that there are probably 50% of your docs on here, of the 504 that I'm looking at right now, probably 50% of them will manage it one way. Well, we'll say there's probably 3 ways to manage this. One way is to do it all underneath their routine vision, and maybe do a retinal OCT, and then maybe do a retinal screener, and then see that patient back in a year. And they'll do it all for their managed vision care evaluation. And that's sort of the optometric way. We don't want to have a conversation about copays and deductibles, and we want to be really good to patients. We really, the thing is about our profession is we're good people, and we want to just take care of patients. And so I totally understand that. I'm not blaming anybody. I'm just saying that's sort of the reality of where we're at. And so they'll just do it under one examination, and they'll say, look, I'm taking care of the patient, and I agree with them. They are. The other, but what they wind up doing is they may not spend as much time if they're trying to see all of that patient and take care of all the glasses prescription and evaluate the OCT and evaluate the retina and have a conversation about that patient's spectacle requirements or contact lens requirements. And they've done that in a time slot that's 20 minutes. The macular degeneration component may be an afterthought for them, not even purposefully. It actually may be an afterthought because in their minds, they're trying to get to that main issue that the patient came in today, is that they need new glasses because their vision at near is blurry. And so they're attending, and then everything else is like, well, you got macular degeneration, and I don't have a bunch of time to dedicate to it. So you don't say that, right? But subconsciously, you're trying to get to the next patient. So the other way that people would do it would be that they're going to have a battle. And when I say a battle, it's not always negative. Practices that have done this really well, it's not negative at all. But they have this battle with a patient to say, we can do this all at once, and we're only, because you have a medical disease, we're going to only bill your medical insurance. You're no longer routine. And then the other part of that is that you sort of serve what that patient's chief complaint was for that specific visit, where that patient comes in and they have blurry vision at near, and that blurry vision is because they have a excuse me, a change in their prescription, and we account for that. And so then, instead of just dealing with everything under that 20-minute exam or half-hour exam, you're saying, I'm going to dedicate my time to talking to you about your vision needs and what's going to make you see better up close. But we're going to address some things with your macular degeneration. But we're going to follow you up in 6 months, 1, to make sure you're not progressing, and 2, to really talk about all the new data, all the new things that are available for us to treat and to monitor for your macular degeneration. And so that's sort of what we're seeing here in this plan. And I think the point is when I work with practices, my most important thing is to, at least no matter which option they choose, is to have them embrace that option, understand what that option affords you and affords the patient. And if that option allows you to serve the patient well, then I'm all for it. You do it the way you want it to do it. And then we customize this for them. So if we have a patient in category 2, we may couple a comprehensive exam with a macular OCT and a retinal screener. There's a value to that. And then we'll see that patient back. In this visit, we may provide a dilated exam. We may do fundus autofluorescence photos or 45-degree posterior pole photos or 30-degree macular photos. We may do some other visual field testing, whether that's dark adaptometry or whether it is 10-2, right? You might do those sorts of things. The point is that what we've done here is we've sort of manufactured what our clinical practice guidelines tell us to do at some amount of intervals and structured it in our practice so that it makes sense, right? In advance.
Chris,
so I'll pause there, and I saw you come off. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, question there. So we have a question. How do you handle billing macula OCT and retinal images on the same day?
Yeah, great question. And so, Chris, what happens a lot of times is people are worried about, okay, I can't do both of these on the same day. Now, there are some nuances where you can do both of them on the same day, but there's a couple things. First is that should not be the norm. It should be exceedingly rare, in my opinion, that you should do that. There are some modifiers that you can use. The biggest thing is that we have a retinal screener, right? So this is a patient paid, right? So what I would advocate for is to make it simple. If I want a macular OCT on the same day that I want a retinal screener, this screener is not going to be billed to insurance. And there's a common misunderstanding with retinal screening. And then let's say I also wanted a fundus autofluorescence. Let's say on the retinal screening. So I'm going to answer your question, but I'm going to answer it a little deeper, Chris. Is that the best way, in my opinion, the cleanest way to do it is if you can separate a retinal photo and an OCT and do them on different days. If it's clinically appropriate, do them on different days. If it's not clinically appropriate, you want to get both images on the same day, the best way to do it is to provide that patient with an ABN, which tells them both of these procedures will be covered on the same but not on the same day. And specifically, I anticipate them not to be covered on the same day, which means you're going to be financially responsible for one of them. In the case of a retinal screener, so that's the best way to do it. The other way to do it is use a modifier, and you may get paid with a modifier. However, my interpretation of what CMS has put out about that modifier is essentially is you should not find yourself doing that in a very frequent manner. So in any case, when you look at this, you have a retinal screener that is a fee that a patient is paying at the beginning to allow you to look at anything on their retina that you know or don't know is going on, right? And specifically that you haven't determined that is a medical necessity to look at. Where you're ordering your macular OCT, now you're saying there is a medical necessity for that. I'm going to order this to evaluate for that, right? Progression in dry macular degeneration or conversion to wet macular degeneration. That might be specifically in my chart. And then I'm going to provide an interpretation or report about how that impacted my patient's clinical care and what information that I got from that. Now, where I really get a lot of questions is, okay, well, what if I wanted to get a retinal photo of something I know is medical and a retinal screener? What I see often, and way too often, docs do this, is that if they find something on their retinal screener, now they'll bill it to the medical, as opposed to ordering another test that is distinctly different from that. Now, that's what you want to be able to do, is order a test from the retinal screener that is distinctly different. Now, the other question I get, Chris, is, as a follow-up is, well, if I order a photo on the same day as the retinal screener, do I just eat the retinal screener? No, you don't. You did that because the patient was, assuming that you informed the patient was willing to do that, and you allowed yourself to find something there that you otherwise may not have found or may not have found as easily. And then you have that patient either back, or you're going to order a test to evaluate that specific thing and monitor it over time. Now, there's a different amount of medical necessity. There's a total medical necessity as opposed to no medical necessity. And then there's also a different amount of responsibility and malpractice that has to cover that other entity that you're monitoring and managing. So I don't know if I answered the question, but there's a lot that you can dig into with macular OCTs and photos. But in this case, what we've done is we've said, look, we're doing a screener. That patient's going to pay out of pocket for it. We're not billing it. We don't have to worry about doing it on the same day. And that's also why, Chris, when you look here, if I were going to split this patient up into multiple visits, and I wanted a fundus autofluorescence, and I wanted a fundus autofluorescent photo of that to see if there's any hypofluorescent. Maybe that's more appropriate for category 3 when you have potential for geographic atrophy in a non-subfoveal area. But the bottom line is that if that were the case, now I don't have to worry about those two things being done on the same day. Right. And if it were my practice and I also wanted to get that OCT, right, very close to this office visit, then I would either order and I wanted to be able to bill, then the cleanest way would be to have that patient back on a separate day, either the one that comes before this office visit or the one that comes after that office visit.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so my point in showing you this is not that this has to be your plan. The point is that you can really break down what your plan would be for any of these specific conditions. So here's the patient, and this patient actually has category 3. You can see that a couple ways. One is these drusen are way larger than 125 microns. I know that 2 ways. One is if we look at this, we can't really see here, but if you look at the central retinal vein, which is probably a little bit larger caliber than what you're seeing here. We have drusen that are way larger than that central retinal vein. And on average, not exactly, but on average, your central retinal vein is about 125 microns. So if you haven't heard me talk before about macular degeneration, one of the things that you can think about is a very easy clinical tool in your chart would be soft drusen, larger than the central retinal vein. And what that tells me is I already know this patient is in category 3. I don't even have to wonder about it. And so if I go back and look at my chart, well, why did I call this patient category 3 versus category 2? I know right away they're in category 3, intermediate AMD. And I know then that's the distinguisher. We won't talk too much about ARED supplementation, but we can get way more into that. The point is that makes the distinguisher. And now I'm going to at least consider and have a conversation with the patient about a full ARED supplement, because that patient now is, based on AREDs, in a category that has shown to have benefits from AREDs. And we can talk about zinc and no zinc and those sorts of things, but that's beyond the scope of this talk, really. This is one interesting clinical finding here. When I see this right there, that pigment clumping where you see this hypopigmentation along with a clump hyperpigmentation, this patient in my mind is a really likely progressor. In fact, when you look at AREDS data, they've done studies to say, which patients are the most likely to progress to category 4. It's these patients that have large drusen in one or both eyes, and then this significant pigment clumping. Those patients are the most likely so I think over the course of 10 years, it's 1 in 2 patients will progress to advanced macular degeneration. I think that's the number. It might be maybe over 5 years, but it's definitely over 10 years. So 50%, right? So these are the patients where I'm thinking, look, you're in a really high risk category. Instead of stratifying them maybe every 6 months or every 4 months, I may want to watch this patient every 3 months, and it may be advantageous. Why? Well, again, this isn't an entirely macular degeneration talk, but we have some time to talk about it, is that there are studies that show us that the earlier we catch patients that are converting from dry to wet, the better their visual acuity is there, the better their long-term visual acuity is after their injection. So what I mean by that is that if we can detect the conversion from dry macular degeneration to wet macular degeneration, the sooner we can do that, the better their long-term visual acuity will be. So I think we get defeated in a lot of ways because we think, oh, well, when that patient gets wet, I'll just send them for injections and their vision's going to get better. But that's fine. They will get better. But but their vision long-term is going to be best if we can detect that when that patient still has good vision when we detect the conversion. So that's why you might stratify that patient to say, this is really high risk, category 3. We're going to monitor you more closely. I probably would see this patient every 3 to 4 months based on the data that we have from that pigment clumping. So if we look at this, a couple things. The first is that if we zoom into these areas, what I wanted to show you was this is a wide field image of that same patient. So if we look at this patient, you can see they correlate pretty well. So again, if you're incorporating wide field technology into your practice, you're going to see that there's some nuances in maybe the amount of pigment that you're seeing, but same day, same images. You can see some things a little bit better in like a VisuCam, like a traditional retinal camera versus like an ultra wide field image, but they're still going to be useful. And then if we take a line scan through that macula, you're going to see a couple things. The first one, and I don't have when they did progress to wet, but our initial evaluation, you can see some pretty large drusen. And if we actually mapped out this drusen based on just calipers from your OCTs, I'm going to guess this is about 500 microns, which actually kind of staggering because it doesn't really look that big. I mean, I think we generally underestimate drusen size. And you'll see that when you actually look at and drop your calipers on those drusen, these are pretty large drus. Probably 500 to 600 microns would be my estimate, just based on what I've looked at clinically. And then this patient, you can see as they progress to wet. So we're watching this patient over time. This one in particular, if I recall correctly, he is, I'll hold back and say he founded sort of a fast food chain. And then he also founded sort of this meat company that would sell to the fast food chain. He sold the fast food chain and now the meat can be found in like all these different supermarkets, but he's a super nice guy. And when he converted to wet, his response was, so I'd been seeing him every 3 to 4 months. And his response was, my vision's just not that clear, but we got him when he was here, he was 2020. When he converted to wet, he was 2025. And he had let it go on. Even I had him doing an Amsler grid. He had let it go on for about 3 weeks before he presented to me. So the point is that it was so important, even after having those conversations with him on multiple occasions, it still took him a while to make the call, right? And his vision was still just subtly different, where he could chalk it up to what he thought was just a change in his glasses prescription. So I think the take home here is that obviously this patient is entitled to more than one disease. I think frequent check-ins allow us to help detect changes. So if I remember correctly on him, he had presented just for his normal 3 to 4 month follow-up. And he just sort of in passing was like, yeah, I think my vision has changed. It wasn't something that actually drove him in, but it had been going on for the last month. And he has meibomian gland dysfunction. He had, before this, he had non-arteritic anterior ischemic optic neuropathy that we were able to manage for him as well. So if we look at the revenue sources of this patient for a 3-year period, 2018 through 2020, He's always been a medical patient. In fact, he's never purchased glasses from me ever. I've provided refraction, so that would be included in that orange that you're seeing there. But I want to reiterate is that if the average OD revenue per OD hour is $402, and was this worth it? Like if I'm an average OD, right? If my practice is functioning at an average, I never sold him glasses. I don't even know that I've sold him supplements. He has the opportunity to buy supplements from my practice, but I can't recall that this is supplements. I think it's all just specifically medical evaluations. And so you can see the first year I saw him, I think probably one time, maybe two times. And then he comes back in here. I think this is probably 2 visits. And this is a significant number of visits because before he transferred to wet, he now all of a sudden decided he was going to come back in because I was able to finally allow him to understand what was going on. And it took 3 hours of my time. So over the course of these 3 years, it took 3 hours of my time. Our practice generated about $1,400. So if we do the math, this patient did not put me in the top 10%, but they put me above the average without selling any glasses or anything. So again, this is the revenue that this patient generated for us. And primarily he's a macular degeneration patient. But in this year of 2020, he did have, I believe, an anterior ischemic optic neuropathy within that as well. So I'll pause there because that is actually, we're kind of perfectly right on time for Chris, your planned break, I believe, right? We're supposed to break right at 5 after. We'll take a 5-minute break.
5-minute break. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's take a 5-minute break. I'm going to start promptly in 5 minutes, and then we'll go from there. So thanks everybody for hanging in there, and we'll be right back.
Sounds good.
All right, everyone. Yeah, 5-minute break. So use the bathroom if you need to, grab a drink, and we'll be back soon. And if you have any questions for when Chris does return for part 2, feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat so that they're ready and we can curate them and we can have them answered for you. So we'll see y'all in a few minutes.
So I'm going to look through the chat here. I know we're back live. Anybody that's listening can listen in, Aaron, but I know we're back live. I'm just going to look through the chat and see if there's something that we should address.
It looks like you got
there's a couple questions. One towards the beginning was, at the beginning, you mentioned the $402 revenue.
Yes.
There was a question asking if that was for exam fees only or if that includes optical income.
Yeah. So I'll answer that first, because I see a couple of these here too. And actually, Chris, like as soon as we get started, and then we can kind of run back into the cases. Would that work okay?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let's do that. So we'll start with that one. So I guess we got another minute and a half or so.
Yep.
Yep.
So whatever you think is pertinent, we'll address them.
Chris, we can probably do that 402 at the end, just because it's a little less, it's a little more off topic than the clinical cases.
Okay,
so,
perfect. Anything about this last case?
There's a question about billing imaging for two different conditions on the same day, like
Yeah.
OCT for glaucoma suspicion and a fundus
Yeah.
photo for diabetes or something like that.
Let me, I'm going to pull something up here. If you can bear with me, if I can share a screen in just a second. So let me find something while we're at the break, because there's a nice shot for that. In fact, I don't know. So I can show people kind of how we arrive at the decision to do that or not to do that. Okay, well, we'll come back. I can't find I've got some slides on that specifically, but I can't find them just in a second. But ask that question, Chris. So you're on mute. Go ahead and ask that question one more time, because I'll try to answer it better.
Yeah, so the question was,
people.
Is it possible to bill imaging on the same day for two different conditions? For example, OCT for glaucoma, retinal image for diabetes.
Yeah. So the short answer is it is possible. That would be a situation where you're probably on the most solid footing to do. That there is. So in that case, you're going to use. Actually, I was going to pull this up so I can tell you the modifier. In that case, you're going to use the modifier. You're going to use a 59 modifier. But the challenge, so here's the problem, is that CMS has these correct coding initiatives, CCI edits, and what they say is that certain things should not be done together, and that's where we get this idea of OCTs and photos should not be done together in the majority of times. What the modifier tells your payer is that I know that these things shouldn't be done together, but I'm modifying it because there's this very specific instance where we would want to do both together. And so when you actually dig into the CCI edits of that specific kind of exclusion, it says same site organ systems. So CMS kind of goes in and talks about this stuff, and it says same site organ systems should not be, you can't modify out of that. And then it goes in and say, okay, well, then I'm thinking, all right, well, is the optic nerve and the macula, are those technically similar organ systems? I mean, I could probably convince myself that maybe they weren't different, but then it basically says you're not using that modifier in the instance where you are performing the service in a specific, like in the specific organ system, right? So I think when you, and looking at the specific same tissue. So I think any way you slice it, it's a little bit flimsy, but the most solid ground would be you order it for your, you know, your diabetes, and you order the other one for your glaucoma. That's probably the most solid footing. But I can tell you, based on, I have the language actually built out into a slide, so you could actually see the language as well. And actually, Dad and Aaron and Chris, if you just email me, I'll find that slide and I'll send you a screen grab of it, so you can actually read that and for the citations. But essentially, my take from that is no, even that is not ideal and not kosher. And so I think then I wonder, all right, well, what's the best thing for the patient? If I have to provide that service on the same day for that patient, I'm going to provide them both. I'm going to modify it, telling them I think that this is reasonable and I don't want to have that patient back. And if I don't get paid, then hopefully I filled out an ABN before. I had the patient fill the ABN out before. But really, that is, I think the interpretation seems to be that you don't do them both on the same day.
Gotcha.
There are ways to get paid for it. People will get paid, Chris. I'll tell you, they'll get paid. But that doesn't mean that on an audit that they don't have solid ground to come back and claim that back from you. And I think that wording tells me they've got pretty solid ground to do it.
Awesome. Sounds good. We can keep things moving and save some more of the questions for the Q&A at the end.
Okay, great. So here we're going to talk about an optic nerve pit. And again, you could think about, when I think about threats to vision and an optic nerve pit, we'll kind of review some of this. But Chris, when you think about an optic nerve pit, and I'm picking on you because you're on my screen, but when you're thinking about an optic nerve pit, your threats to vision, I'm sure you would tell me, are risk for visual field loss, whether that's progressive or not. We do know that patients with optic nerve pits are more likely to develop glaucoma than patients who don't have optic nerve pits. But also, probably a more immediate threat to vision is cystoid macular edema, right? CME, from that, or more like a schisis, not so much cystoid, but schisis leakage of fluid into the sensory retina, which will appear slightly cystic. But in any case, we're concerned about their macula. So you could kind of build this patient experience out like glaucoma, although I'm not going to sit and kind of cover all these things like we did with AMD, because I do have a glaucoma case at the end where I can probably cover it better there. But essentially, the whole idea is we're building out what might be sort of, if I'm expecting this patient to have ocular hypertension, this is what I'm going to do on my first visit. This is what I'm going to do on a second visit. If they're glaucoma suspect, it's basically the same. If they have mild glaucoma, presumably I would be treating them, and you'll see some of these codes possibly change, et cetera, and the amount of tests that we do. One of the things that I think is really important to remember is that, and one of the mistakes I see ODs making a lot of times is they say, well, if I have to order a field a couple times, I'm not sure if I'm going to get flagged for an audit. Well, the first thing I always tell people is that if you're worried about an audit, your chart should protect you from an audit. So if you want to do a field 3 times a year for a patient with ocular hypertension, that probably shouldn't be the norm based on our clinical practice guidelines. But if you have a unique patient that is bad at fields or gives you some messy fields, it's fine to do fields more frequently, as long as you're supporting that in the chart. The other thing to know is that in our clinical practice guidelines, if you look at and the preferred practice patterns, and even if you look in Europe for some of their other guidance, you should expect on the initial diagnosis of glaucoma, they actually expect up to 6 fields over the course of 2 years. That is actually what they expect to be performing. So in most cases, I'm not saying do 6 fields on a patient with ocular hypertension. I'm saying our clinical practice guidelines say annually, but that doesn't mean we have to always do annually. If we see something else on a field that makes us more suspicious or more concerned, we can be the doctor and make sure that the chart documentation reflects the fact that you're uncertain about something and that you need to repeat a field. So in this case, if we're going to talk about specialty services and specialty tools that we probably all have in our practice, or many of us do, ultra wide field imaging, we can use as a retinal screener. We can also use it, you'll see here, as evaluating not just the optic nerve, but the macula as well, and the peripheral retina. You can look at your OCT. You can look at your fundus autofluorescence as a potential. You can also look at a field, which actually I didn't include here, but it is. And this patient had additional needs. So I was able to serve her needs over time for meibomian gland dysfunction. She also did decide to purchase materials from our practice as well. So we're going to talk about all of that, but let's get to the case. So this patient came in with blurry vision that fluctuates. This is the first time I saw her. She was 35 at the time. She's in her mid 40s now, early 40s now. When I start thinking about some of that stuff, it makes me feel older. But anyway, it happens at all ranges. Vision is troublesome, making her computer difficult to see. And she was primarily in for her managed vision care. And you can see on her manifest, we can get her corrected to 2015 on the right, 2020 on the left. That's a little bit suspicious there. Yes, she's 20/20, but why? Her refraction is relatively similar between the two eyes. She doesn't have any other history of strabismus. I don't detect any history. So I'm wondering why there's a difference. And then we look inside of her eyes. So you look at her CD ratio, 0.3 on the right, 0.5 on the left. Intraocular pressure is equal between the eyes and low. Now, here's a great, so what do we do in this case? Let's say this patient, I'm going to kind of amplify a different way to think about this is that, so I see this patient back and I see this nerve and I see her 20/20 vision in the left eye. But I want to know more about what's going on in this left eye. In fact, if I were going to zoom in on those two areas in the right and the left eye, I might see something like this. Well, what do I know about this patient? There's obviously some asymmetry in her optic nerve. I have identified something in this patient that I want to know more about. The question I have to ask myself is, am I going to answer all those questions today on the comprehensive exam? Or am I going to have that patient back at some interval to answer those questions so that I can be confident? Do I think this is glaucoma? No, I mean, right away, I can pretty much see that there's an inferior optic nerve pit right here, an inferior temporal optic nerve pit. She actually has some leakage up here when we look at her OCT. The point is that when we're trying to structure our patients' follow-ups, the question I always ask myself is, and that patient is in for a comprehensive exam, no, right, then vision, which in theory, depending on the way it flows, could be a medical chief complaint. It wasn't. And so I have to ask myself, can I answer these questions at some period in the future? Now, a lot of times sorry, I know my internet said it was stable. Am I good again, Chris? All right. So a lot of times we want to know all this information, and if we can't answer all those questions at the comprehensive exam, we're unsure how to manage that uncertainty. So one way to do that would be to say, tell the patient what you see, show the patient the images, have some sort of idea of what you think is going on, have that patient back at an interval that you think is clinically appropriate. Clearly, this patient didn't have any symptoms. Clearly, they're not going to have significant vision loss progression over time based on what we're seeing, but we want more information. So probably a month is within the next month to investigate further is completely appropriate. Maybe you could even push that out if you had some other history. You could push it out even longer, especially if she said, yeah, in the past, somebody told me that my optic nerve looks a little bit weird in my left eye, and okay, that's been going on for a long time. Maybe we push it out a little further based on that history. The point is that we don't have to answer every single question when that patient comes in and at the comprehensive exam. And that's a lot of times one of the things that optometrists have a big challenge with when they're trying to do both medical and managed vision care is they want to answer all the questions. And I'll tell you right now, you don't have to. Now, I also will tell you that when I interpreted this macula and the very first time I saw her, before I saw her back a month later, I thought this was actually an epiretinal membrane. As you look deeper at it now, I mean, and easily you can see that it's not an epiretinal membrane. It's almost sort of like folds that are deeper than that. But that's how I interpreted it. So I think if you look at, and here's her OCT that we do over time, and you can see quite a bit of thickness in her RNFL here. You almost will have some thinning here superiorly, which is why you'll see a little bit more of a defect in her optic nerve or in her visual field. So here's her visual field in the left eye. So I'm showing you the left eye here, the right eye there, and she's got this inferior extension of her blind spot. And at first blush, that doesn't make a lot of sense because you see that inferior area that's leading toward her macula. So you'd expect something up here. I think we probably have a little bit, but it's not significantly impacting your vision. So we know it is impacting your visual field. And I think I show you what my impression was. Maybe I don't. I think my impression was on this first exam for the patient was that she had an epiretinal membrane and an optic nerve pit. So I had misdiagnosed that. But it was, again, both of those things were the epiretinal membrane was misdiagnosed as the potential for fluid. And I would be able to uncover that on an OCT, which is what we do on a follow-up, right? So again, I'm ordering the OCT because I don't know exactly what's going on in the macula. And so we look at that OCT. And this is what we see. So here's her right eye. And now I see, okay, well, I'm not really seeing a significant epiretinal membrane. I mean, maybe she's got one here, but it's not undulating. That's not where the problem is that I was seeing it. I was seeing this sort of schisis splitting of the macula with these sort of cystic spaces. And you can see it's really coming from that pit in the optic nerve that's leaking in. And so I'll tell you that this patient was 20/20 at that initial visit. So I want to show you a couple things. So what do we do? How do we manage this patient over time? Well, essentially what we did was we saw her back at the 1 month. We find out exactly that this is what's going on. She's correctable to 20/20. We identify that this has likely been going on for a long time. So I see her back 3 months later. So here's 3 months later. She's a little thicker, right? You can see that now she's got these cystic changes that are thicker here. She still is asymptomatic. And so we don't do anything. And now I think part of this is, Chris, is having a good relationship with your retinal surgeons that you use to know when they want to treat them. Because you could send, and that's how we get to manage uncertainty a little bit better, is like, is this patient going to be treated? Well, the treatment options for these patients include laser. So basically laser around that optic nerve, kind of like a focal grid laser, although it's not in the macula, to try to seal off some of that fluid leakage. It can include vitrectomy. It can include bubble tamponades. So it can be pretty significant treatments. The bottom line is, what do I know from my retinal surgeon? Well, I need to know I've got a patient with an optic nerve pit and schisis in the macula. And the first question he asks me is, what's her vision? 20/20, he's not going to touch her. Even at 20/30, she had to kind of convince him. We did some things before that we needed to do some other things. So what did we do? Well, she comes in. She stayed at 20/20 and kind of fluctuated back and forth between these two areas over the course of a year or two. And then she finally had enough fluid in that macula that her vision was 20/30. And so she didn't want to intervene with surgery. And so I said, look, this is our next option. I want to send you to a retinal surgeon and they're going to provide some options for you. And she said, no, I don't really want to see anybody right now. I'm not noticing it too much. I know it's a little blurrier, but I'm not noticing it too much. Is there anything else we can try? And I said, okay, well, there's some cysts here. Maybe we could try some medication. And there's a couple things. The first thing is that there's no FDA approved medication that's going to treat this. It's all completely off label. But here's my rationale. Is there a potential fluid leaking in here that is potentially leading some additional inflammation that we could potentially control with some type of topical NSAID? Maybe. I don't know. But what it did was it allowed us to go another month on this patient, see her closely. She can try to do something to see if it improves. When it doesn't, now she's willing to take the next step. And that's what we did for her. My initial, the best recommendation I could give her was, let's see the retinal surgeon. She doesn't want that. We meet her where she's at. We give her other options to either monitor, which would probably have been fine, or potentially see if there's any other inflammatory component that spreading out of tissue does. Again, it's just understanding what might be going on. It didn't work, right? So that's okay. It didn't work. And so this is what we see. So we did wind up sending her to a retinal surgeon. You can see here where he walls off some of that inferior fluid leakage. So she's got some areas down here. I would expect if I were going to run a visual field on her that we may have some increased blind spot, a worse increased blind spot over time. That hasn't happened, but that would be something to expect clinically. And you can see here before treatment and then here after treatment. This looks relatively similar. This is her retinal scarring as well. So we continue to monitor over time. And what's pretty cool is that here's her pre-laser macular OCTs. 3 months post-laser, she's back to 20/20. She still has some schisis. This is 2 years post-laser. You can see a little bit of disruption of this RPE, but her macula, other than that, looks completely normal. And so, the point here is that I've had good enough conversations with her retinal surgeon to know that he is going to be, when I do have to refer her to him or any of my patients to him, we've had conversations. So I know when he's going to pull the trigger, literally and figuratively, and he knows that I'm going to be able to follow this patient over time. So he's going to get that patient right back to me because he trusts me enough to do that. And that's where I think your communication is going to come into play with the surgeons that you use for specific instances. So I think the other thing about this case is that over the period of time that we had to do other things. So I think 2018 or maybe even before is when she had fluid. Well, in this year, in 2019, she actually needed other ocular surface treatment. So she needed treatment of her meibomian glands. We needed to provide a little bit more intensive therapy from a medical standpoint, but she also needed glasses. And so if you look at this, what I think is interesting about this case is that the very first year I saw her, she didn't buy glasses from my practice. So this is back in, 7-8 years ago, she didn't buy glasses in our practice. But because I was able to manage and monitor those things and I built confidence in her over time, I will call it a halo effect. I think what extends is that we're providing really good care in our practices in the dark rooms that we do. And when we do that, and even if we're not focused on selling glasses or contact lenses to that specific patient on that specific visit, you can see in this year that she needed a whole bunch of additional, like not covered, medically covered services, as well as out-of-pocket services that might be specialty. She was able to still figure out a way to get her glasses with her routine in our practice. So I call it a halo effect, right? We were able to provide her really good care in the back of the house that extended to the front of the house as well. And we never had any conversations with her about, I never had any conversations that she needs this type of lens and this type of pair of glasses and why our glasses and lenses are better than any place else she can go. I never had to have that conversation with her. She intuitively understood that over time as we were able to take care of her needs. And so that translated then over the course of those, you're seeing 4 years here, 4 hours of total visits, and over $4,000 of actual collected revenue. So revenue that we actually collected, not just billed out, but collected in the practice. And so what you can see is that in this case, we're performing well over that top 10% decile for that specific patient for the amount of time that it took for me to manage her. So again, we could talk about any of those other nuances if you'd like, but the point is that by focusing on her optic nerve in this case, we were able to serve that need, but also serve the other needs in the practice of things that we can offer to that patient when she needs them. So obviously, patients' clinical take home for optic nerve pits, they're at risk for glaucoma, they're at risk for schisis and edema. Having a discussion with that patient about monitoring allows you to identify changes, not just in their vision, but also that they're coming back to you for other treatment options, right? They're coming back because they trust you for that, to manage the vision things that they're at risk for. And when they do convert, you can have other conversations about this is why you're seeing this way, or this is now why your vision is fluctuating. It's not because of the schisis. It's not because that you need to change your glasses prescription. It's because your tear film is so poor. So in any case, that's the take home from that case. So let's look then at a choroidal nevus. Now this probably will stimulate some conversations for a couple reasons, and I'll try to hit on why I anticipate that to stimulate some questions. But I guess I did a little bit, but the point here is that this patient had imaging, had screening, and then we also have a fundus autofluorescence, and I will hit on this point. So, and then we were able to provide LASIK post-op for her. So she, again, over time, decided she wanted to have LASIK, and our practice was able to get her in the hands of a really good surgeon and she decided to come back to our practice for the post-operative services. She also had dry eye preoperatively and post-operatively, which we had to manage for her as well. So you can actually see that there are different pillars. We had to serve her choroidal nevus. We served her contact lens pillar. We also were able to serve her dry eye pillar, and you could actually add another in here that is surgical care, right? So we're able to serve this patient in a number of different ways.
And so let's talk about this case. So here's a patient, kind of our general standard flat choroidal nevus, nothing that suspicious. She's here for a nevus evaluation. She feels like her night vision isn't as good. Managed vision care plan changed the prior year, so she saw somebody else who didn't mention the nevus. So she's back now, or she's here now. She has had it's mild, it's going on for a little while, no flashes or floaters. So here's our nevus. If we use fundus autofluorescence, there's some studies that show us that nevi, before they change or as they are changing in size and shape, can also produce lipoffusion, which, as we know, we can see on fundus autofluorescence. So if you have that technology, I think it's really helpful. And you can see here how it disappears in the when we remove the choroid, and it'll reappear when we look just at the choroid. And then when we look at fundus autofluorescence, we will see that there's no hyper or hypofluorescence over that choroidal nevus. So here's how, from a documentation standpoint, this might go. And again, I think this is actually a highly reasonable approach. You may have some more challenges. So I want to anticipate some questions here. So let's say we order our Optos, or the patient gets an ultra wide field screening, and then we use an Optos Plus to look at a nevus and evaluate that. That is legitimate. Where you might have a problem is on an audit, if the nevus is stationary, it's stable, 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 and every year you're ordering a photo to evaluate and monitor, there could be an argument. I think it would be hard. I think you could justify it still, but there could be an argument made by an auditor that would say, you should be able to look inside the patient's eye and look at a photo to know that that hasn't changed. You should be able to look here, compare it to there. And because the photo shows me what I should be able to see clinically otherwise, I don't have to repeat that photo. Okay. I think that's a legitimate argument. I don't think that that completely negates repeating photos over time for patients, but it certainly makes it a little bit more, you're on a little shakier ground if you can't show change. Because again, you could say, I think you could say to the auditor, well, I can't know the patient's moving around, and I can see exactly one on top of the other. I can know exactly it hasn't changed, okay? I still think that they can make a case. Again, it's probably not that likely, but they could make a case. Where I like fundus autofluorescence, and I also like OCTs, is that when you order fundus autofluorescence for a choroidal pigmentation that you suspect is a nevus, as opposed to a choroidal melanoma, you can't look at fundus autofluorescence any other way. I cannot look at a slit lamp on a dilated exam with a fundus lens or with a BIO at fundus autofluorescence and see that there's no lipoffusion pigment that's being produced. I can't do that. And so I think it's highly justifiable if you have that as part of the test that you're ordering with fundus autofluorescence. Now, I think that's an argument that you could actually make with an auditor in those situations that would really be solid. And in my chart, what I like to do is I think it's probably overkill, but it does underscore what we're actually doing. So in this case, let's say she comes back the next year. One of the things that my chart from a billing and coding standpoint might say would be to say, order Optos Plus fundus autofluorescence to evaluate and monitor choroidal pigmentation for the progression to choroidal melanoma. And what I've done is I haven't presumed that this is a choroidal nevus yet, even though I think you could. But what you're showing them is the uncertainty that you're trying to solve with your fundus autofluorescence by ordering it. And now I'm saying it's a choroidal pigmentation. I want to make sure it's not a choroidal melanoma and producing weird pigment. So we're going to do that. And then in my interpretation, I will say no hyper or hypofluorescence over choroidal nevus. So just like we're seeing here, no hyper or hypofluorescence over choroidal nevus, or choroidal pigmentation consistent with choroidal nevus, not choroidal melanoma. Monitor in 1 year, something like that, right? That's how I would describe what I'm seeing there clinically. So in any case, for this patient, again, this patient is purely has been a medical. She has had no routine services I think she had LASIK in 2012. So she really had no need for routine services before that or after that. Until 2019, and then then you're seeing she missed 2018
and then she's seeing 2019 through 2021. So again, she doesn't buy glasses from us. She does have the need for additional dry eye services, but you can see that the amount of time that we spent with her over those 3 years is an hour and a half, which has generated about $1,500 in revenue for the practice, and just purely medical revenue. So stuff that you can do on a regular basis that you would do for those patients. And again, part of that, I'll tell you right now, part of that is because our fees are such that are valued in a way that medical payers will value them, right? So we aren't leaving fees on the table for that. So that's another part of how this all works out for that patient. Okay, so so this is I think the take home here is that this patient, I've seen this patient since probably I was really early in practice. I think I saw her in 2008, 2009. She had LASIK in 2010 to 2012, sometime in there, if I'm recounting her. And she would always see me every year. See me, she'd come in, how's my nevus? How's my freckle doing? How's my nevus doing? And what was very interesting to me is I've never billed her managed vision care plan ever, because since probably early in 2009, 2008, I haven't billed it since after her LASIK surgery. And she went someplace else because her managed vision care plan changed. And then when her managed vision care plan changed back to me being on it, she was able to resume she was able to resume her care with me. Now, her medical plan never changed, and we have never billed her managed vision care plan in 12 years, because that wasn't her chief complaint. Her chief complaint was always to look at her freckles since her LASIK. And so what that tells me is a couple things. The first one is this isn't an isolated instance. I see this often when patients will have their managed vision care plans change. They will associate who they can see based on their managed vision care plan. And that actually does kind of inform my decisions about whether or not we're going to drop managed vision care plans when I'm as busy as I want to be, which I am, or we're going to keep them to basically and add new associates. And that's what we've done. And so we essentially say, look, once I'm as busy as I want or need to be in the practice, I'm going to add new associates that can take care of that patient's managed vision care needs. And then they can build their practice as well over time. Now, another avenue would be I'm as busy as I want to be, and I don't want to have to mess with new associates, and I want to keep my practice where it is. So then maybe I decide to start dropping those plans. If you do that, you want to make sure you're very clear about communicating with the patients specifically that you are still a provider on their medical plans, and not necessarily have a very conscious and planned way to communicate with the patients that come into your office, that you can still submit their visits because you may have been watching them for whatever else, right? So you can actually take a proactive approach for that. So again, I think that's probably the most important thing about this case, beyond just the discussion of maybe how we manage patients with choroidal nevi. Chris, any questions just yet?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions. One is about billing visual field 10-2 for macular degeneration. Is that only for intermediate and later stages?
Yeah, I think the question really stems around what's the clinical necessity to it? How is it going to change your treatment and your understanding of this patient? So I would generally say yes. The short answer would be yes. Not so much because like you can't ever do it in a patient that has early macular degeneration. Maybe that patient is complaining of central visual field defects that you can't answer with your OCT or your refraction. And you're saying, look, this patient doesn't see as well as they should. Let's see what their 10-2 looks like. That's appropriate. But on a regular basis, you may say that, look, this patient has an area of geographic atrophy. And that area of geographic atrophy is non-subfoveal, but it's pretty darn close to fixation. I want to see how significant that is in their vision loss. That would be another area that you would want to look at in a patient with intermediate. I'll tell you that for me, if I don't see any, I rarely do 10-2s on macular degeneration patients unless I see geographic atrophy. So if I don't see geographic atrophy that's non-subfoveal or subfoveal, I won't usually do a 10-2. And because I don't think that it gives me a ton of extra clinical value. If it does, then I'll run it. If I'm considering what why this patient isn't seeing as well, or they have these areas of blind spots, I want to plot those blind spots out and see how they're enlarging over time. I think that's justifiable, but I don't do it on a routine basis on earlies or even intermediates. But I think you're much more justifiable in doing it in intermediate.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Another question is, so what happens if you're doing a test and the patient is a poor test taker and its results are not very reliable? Is it appropriate to bill the test on that day?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. And remember, when we're doing an interpretation and report of a test, we're telling, part of our interpretation and report is to comment on the reliability of that patient and a reliability of that scan. And so you do an OCT. Well, I'll answer your question in a second, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper into something else. If I do OCT, because I want to prove a point, if I do OCT on a patient and the scan quality is a 6 out of 10, and I get good-ish, but I'm not hugely confident in it because it's not as good a quality as I'd like, you can bill that. You can totally bill that. And you should bill that because you provided because there's two things happen. One is you provided a technical component to that test. You provided the test. You did everything you do to that to obtain that information. You also provided
Chris, I think we're losing you.
Yeah. Oh, darn.
No, I think it's going to come back on.
You guys, if that was me, or I'm sure it was me. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
All right. Another where I cut out, I may have said something about having a good quality test, of a technical component, of a professional component. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you said you performed a
those.
technical component, so it'd be appropriate to bill. That's where you left off.
You perform the technical component, and if you also perform the professional component, it's appropriate to bill. And part of your acknowledgement is, I'm sure that's me. Sorry about that. I've got 9 kids that are probably trying to jump on the internet.
Chris, try stopping your video for a little bit. Sometimes it helps.
I will.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So I'll watch you guys if I go out again. So is this okay? Can you still hear me all right?
Yep.
Yep.
All right. So if still bill that, and you actually might want to run another one. You might say, look, that was patient didn't. So that's where you take it to the field, right? So let's do a field. You get information, but the patient's looking all over the place. You provided a technical component. Looked at that field to say, okay, well, is this field concerning for me enough where I have to run the again in a week or 2 weeks or 6 months or a year? Or is the data just so bad that I've got to repeat it tomorrow, right? You've done the analysis of that. As the professional, you should get compensated for that, right? As long as what you're putting in your chart is, patient had poor reliability due to fixation losses, monitor in 1 week, whatever, repeat field in this much time. So absolutely, you've done the work. You've provided a service. You should absolutely bill it.
Awesome. One more question before moving on, Chris. Can you elaborate a little bit on billing follow-up visits as a 99213 as opposed to like a 92012?
Yeah, great. So, and actually, let me quickly, I know I can switch quickly to another presentation because this will actually tell the story a little bit better. Okay, so if we look at the RVU analysis for code hierarchies, let me share this. All right, so if we look at code hierarchy, essentially what I've done here, what you're seeing is if you look at CMS, they value codes based on the professional component, the medical liability component, and then the kind of overhead component or the facility component. And when you break that down, you get a RVU value, and then you get a fee associated with that based on a conversion factor. Well, if you set your fees appropriately, in most cases, you're assuming that your payers are following what CMS has done. In 2021, things flipped around a little bit based on new and established, but this is essentially what you're looking at. So if you qualify for a level 3 based on what you've documented and what that patient's necessity is, you're actually, it's more advantageous to bill that 992X3 than it is to bill an intermediate exam by about $3 to $4. So it's not huge, but it is not, it's not nothing. Where you really wind up having it be advantageous is if you have a level 4, like a 992X4, and you're looking, do I use a level 4 or an intermediate exam? It's like $40. It's like $40 difference between, for CMS, for Medicare national averages, to use your 992X4 than it is to use your intermediate exam. Now, there's a couple things that people will say is they'll say, well, on those follow-ups, Chris, what about just using a 920X4? And if you qualify for it, but if remember that if let's say I'm seeing a patient back for glaucoma in 6 months, right? Maybe they're a mild glaucoma patient, and I provided a comprehensive exam 6 months prior. Our clinical practice guidelines wouldn't say that I need to do EOMs, cover tests, basic sensory motor examination on that 6-month follow-up for glaucoma. Our clinical practice guidelines don't suggest that I should be doing that every 6 months. So the question is, did I do what was necessary for a comprehensive exam on that follow-up just because I do it? Or I do it because that patient specifically needs it. So in those cases, I probably really am wondering, I'm often curious, do I need to do a comprehensive exam based on clinical practice guidelines when I'm monitoring additional diseases over time more than once a year? Our clinical practice guidelines would pretty much support it on an annual basis. Outside of that, you got to wonder why you're doing it. So let's say then, Chris, if I had a patient come back for that glaucoma evaluation and they all of a sudden they're also complaining of double vision. Well, maybe I did want to do a comprehensive exam because I want to see, do they have full EOMs? Do they have an appropriate cover test, something like that? Then I could probably justify it based on that chief complaint. But just because their patient is back 6 months after I did a comprehensive exam for glaucoma, probably not justifiable. And that actually underscores this idea, Chris, of making sure that we're not just doing every single thing on every single patient all the time. Because it's just not necessary. First of all, it's not justified. And then on an audit, even if we billed it and got paid on an audit, it's unlikely that you'd survive that as medical necessity on multiple times a year. Not that you couldn't do it, but you want to make sure you'd have a medical necessity for it. As far as the intermediate goes, the level 3 and intermediate exams are so close together that the $4 difference is probably not a huge one. And so, if you've satisfied what is required for this and you generally feel like, oh, that's just an easier one to qualify for, then fine, use it, right? But make sure you understand why you're using it and saying, look, I think from an audit standpoint, this is going to be easier to protect. I would actually argue that this is actually easier to protect now in 2021 and beyond for your 99 codes because they're all MDM. And if you understand MDM or time, then it's very straightforward to it takes some time to kind of wrap your mind around it for sure. But if you understand it, then it's very straightforward to arrive at those codes, and they're going to be justifiable based on chief complaints and the resultant diagnosis codes that you're arriving at.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Anything else?
Not for now. You can continue.
Okay, great. All right, so this should take us back to this case, I believe. Glaucoma, yeah, glaucoma. Okay. Can you see this still again? We're talking about glaucoma, yeah? Okay. So again, this is very similar to our case, and this essentially is just a patient with glaucoma. And how are we going to monitor that patient over time? Obviously, OCT, some form of imaging, and a field. And then when we look at this patient, a couple times. So she's here for glaucoma evaluation. We have already done our comprehensive exam on this patient. We had already identified that this patient had a risk factor. And I want to make somebody kind of uncomfortable now. And I'd like to do this recently, but I want to make many people uncomfortable here. Let me ask, Chris, you guys were, and we have eye cares in my practice. I have eye cares in every room because we were running. That was a pain point when we were doing pre-test, where eye care and pre-test would be the kind of bog down. So we decided to, at the exchange, Aaron, we got eye cares for all 2 more of our rooms that we didn't have them for. And I bring that up to say, many of the people on the call here, and I'm going to make people uncomfortable, and I probably will make people upset with me. So on the reviews, they won't ask me to come back. But the thing that I want to do is I want to underscore what a comprehensive eye exam does. How many people, I want you to consider, is this you? I will tell you this is me, okay? Or this has been me. I see a patient, my eye care tonometry comes back at 26 and 21, and the patient is a 42-year-old white male. Let's say they're a 42-year-old Asian, and not just Asian, but let's say they're from Korea. So we know that there might be some risk for narrow angles, those sorts of things, but doesn't matter. So I see this flag that makes me uncomfortable clinically. Chris, what do you do? Comprehensive managed vision care exam. You've taken pressures with eye care, or your staff has. What do you do? What do you do on that exam? What's your next step? Before you talk to the patient about it, what do you want to do? What's your gut as an optometrist?
I almost always get pachymetry for high pressures.
Yeah. And before you do that, are you rechecking their pressure with Goldman?
We have a hysteresis. Does that count? That's pretty accurate.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say my point in asking this question is, when I ask it live, it's hard to do virtually, and I'm kind of butchering it here. But my point in asking the question is, we are sort of geared to be like, oh, I wonder if that's a real pressure. I wonder if the patient just didn't squeeze their eyes or blink. I'm going to recheck it with Goldman. And I would challenge you that the comprehensive managed vision care plan doesn't pay you to recheck a bunch of times, right? They're not reimbursing us to recheck with corneal hysteresis on that visit, or Goldman on that visit, or even just recheck a whole bunch of times with eye care, right? The question I'm trying to stimulate is, what triggers you to see that patient back on a separate follow-up, right? And I would argue that if we're firing on all cylinders and we're understanding what the managed vision care plan is compensating us for, they're compensating us for to gather a bunch of information and to screen that patient for other diseases. And when I say screen, it doesn't mean screener like I'm sticking my hand in or my shoulder or my arm in a blood pressure cuff. It means figure out if that patient has other reasons that they need to be monitored over time. That's what it means. So I'm pushing to say, do we even do the Goldman? Do we even do the corneal hysteresis right away? Because what it does is when we do that, or we do the pachymetry right away, then immediately Chris says, oh, well, I'm not that concerned about the patient's pressure that's 26. And so I'll just see them back next year, as opposed to thinking about the fact that you actually had a whole bunch of knowledge, education, and training that informed your idea of what we should be doing with that patient. And you've lost value. The patient has actually lost value, not to mention the fact that you might be artificially, I know I might be, this is what I would do. I might be artificially at ease because their OCT that I ran as a screener, because their pressures were a little higher, looks normal. But then over time, I may not monitor them as closely because I'm not as committed to that over time, because I know, oh, their OCT was normal and their pressures have been high in the past. So my point is just making you uncomfortable enough to say, oh, maybe I should have that patient back for another follow-up visit. And that does have value to a system. Anyway, I'll get off that soapbox. I do those same things in my practice, by the way. I do the same things in my practice. But as optometrists, a lot of times we're geared to being like, let's just recheck until we come back with the normal answer. Anyway, when we think about glaucoma in this patient, she's back. You can pretty well see that she's got thicker pecs in both eyes, moderately elevated IOP, but still within that range of where we could apply the ocular hypertension treatment study to her. And so when we look at this, we look at our initial RNFL defect. And you can see, here's our RNFL, looks relatively full when we're looking at those scans. And then when we look at the numbers, okay, we're paying attention to this over time. We can see that, 133, 152, and we are committed to this process. Chris, I could say that this patient has relatively thick packs. They have pressures that are in the mid-20s. And when I look at her nerves, they look relatively healthy. Maybe there's a little asymmetry right and left. There's no significant RNFL defects. In fact, when I look at this left nerve superiorly, we're really thick, really, especially superior nasally. My point is, if I am not committed to this process over time of monitoring this patient where I'm taking time to delve into it, I could easily miss something like this, where we go from 1 year at 133 microns superiorly and 152 microns inferiorly to 137 in this clock hour. And in this quadrant, we've got 120. So again, I'm going back here. We can see this change over time. And if this were a consistent change, that's way more than 10 microns, right? We're 13 microns in the entire quadrant. And in this one specific clock hour, we're 15 microns difference. So that's pretty significant, but they still flag as green. My point in showing you this is just to underscore the fact that if I'm committed to monitoring this patient over time, I'm going to be able to see much more subtle defects earlier on in the case. And you can see here that if we watch this patient over time, we can see that we're now getting some consistent thinning that is repeatable over time on our OCT findings. Now, her field, I believe her field is relatively similar, but again, I would have wondered, had I just stopped doing the field at some point, could we have been able to see this? Or maybe I never did, stopped doing her OCT at some point because it looked normal, and she's got thick pecs. Should I continue over time? Well, my answer to that is, does the patient get more risky over time or less risky over time, right? As they age, what does the Beaver Dam Eye study show us about the incidence of glaucoma? The Beaver Dam Eye study shows us Caucasian patients over the age of 40, or 2.1% of the population, have glaucoma. If we look at populations as they age, that continues to increase, and probably the highest risk factor are going to be African Americans, and then pretty much everybody else except for Caucasian Americans are going to have a higher risk incidence of glaucoma as they age than Caucasian Americans, who also will have a higher risk incidence as they age. So the point is that I might feel comfortable right now when I'm seeing that patient, but being committed to a process and a protocol and following that not only is financially rewarding to the practice, but it also helps the patient because now we've identified changes earlier than we otherwise would have identified them. And you can see here, if this visual field was repeatable over time, there may be, in the right eye, I think this defect was in the left eye. Yes, in the left eye. And then over time, you can see, our field may change over time. I don't think I actually give you the way the field changes, but essentially her field, I think we've caught it pre-parametric. So in any case, patients sometimes just remember the care that we provide, but they consistently discuss, when you're consistent to that process and following up with that patient, you have the opportunity to intervene earlier with those cases specifically related to optic nerve disease. And so you can see here, we were able to show this patient that she had some progression. You can see our medical necessity, our routine services. And again, on this visit, we have a component that on this year, she doesn't come back this year. On this year, she's coming back for her routine, where she buys glasses, as well as additional medical services. So that's how, in this case, we are still achieving revenue that's over that highest top 10% decile. 2 hours of time, about $750 dollars per OD hour. And I think we wanted questions now. Is that right? Or is that the time? If I stop here, we're right at time for questions?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Let's see. One question is, someone asked, you mentioned the clinical practice guidelines. Where's the best place to find those?
Yeah, actually, you can Google AOA clinical practice guidelines, and you should be. So you shouldn't trust Chris Wolfe's opinion. They are there. AOA clinical practice guidelines. You can look at AMD. You can look at glaucoma. Some of them are a little outdated, and so the preferred practice, same thing. You can Google PPP, or preferred practice pattern, American Academy of Ophthalmology, and you'll find all of theirs as well. So they kind of help us fill in if we have one that's a little outdated, or they have one that's a little outdated, ours will be more updated. And so it's good to kind of compare and contrast.
All right. Another person asked, do you consider dilation part of a managed vision care plan exam?
So I think the easy way to answer that is, what does your contract tell you what you ought to be doing? If your contract says that they to bill a comprehensive exam that they want you to use dilation, then you should be doing that. In my mind, for a comprehensive exam, we have ultra wide field imaging. So we have an optos in my practice, and I'm committed to saying, look, if you come into my practice, you're either going to get an optos or you're going to be dilated, right, on that visit for your comprehensive exam. Now you can structure that. So my approach is, I want to structure that when I'm seeing a patient. I want to be in with that patient one time. I don't want to be in and out. I want to be efficient with my time. And so what have we done? Well, there's a couple ways to do this, and we can talk through them, and you can figure out the way that you want to do it. But let's say the patient doesn't get an optos, and our acceptance rate is about 90 to 95% with optos. They don't get an optos, they come back and I see them, then it's not remember, this is a screening dilation. What I mean by that is, think about this differently. When I say screening dilation, that can kind of feel weird, but I mean it to say that if I have a patient that has flashes and floaters, and I'm going to do scleral depression, or I'm going to do a Goldman 3 mirror on them, that is a distinctly different dilation than a routine dilation, right? So I make that point to say, if a patient comes in, they don't get optos, and I want to dilate them, well, we'll dilate them. And if I'm really apprehensive about dilating the patient before, or like having my techs do that, one thing you could do would be to check your angles first, make sure it's appropriate to dilate them if you want to be efficient with your time. And then right before you do your refraction, you get them dilated, right? So are they going to be fully blown after your refraction? No, they're going to have function for your accommodative ability. Are you going to be able to do a scleral depression and get a lot of information out of that, or a Goldman 3 mirror? No, you're not. Are you going to have a bigger pupil that you're going to get stereopsis on the optic nerve and macula and retinal vessels and probably mid periphery? Yes, you will. And so because of that, you certainly can do that. That's how I would probably approach that scenario is, and if you really want to, you could have the patient be dilated before you even walk in with them. Your staff could do it if assuming they're doing a refractive care. But I want to see some sort of, extent of the retina on a comprehensive managed vision care plan.
Gotcha. A couple more questions, Chris. One is going back towards the very beginning of your presentation where you mentioned 402 per hour
Yes.
for revenue per patient. Is that exam fees only, or were you including optical in that number?
That's everything. So that's basically revenue total in the practice that is just being generated by the doctor's time that's being there. And then as far as, so that's why I like it, is because it doesn't, it means that if a patient, I'm seeing a patient for a managed vision care plan and they buy glasses or 2 pairs or 3 pairs or contact lenses for an annual supply, then it's all dumped into there. And so I can say, look, if this is my revenue now and I want to add a new service, is that new service going to generate the same amount of revenue per hour that I'm dedicating to it, or more than what I'm accustomed to? If it's a service, again, if it's a service that's generating less than $402 or whatever my revenue per OD hour is now, and I want that to be larger, then I need to be able to offer that service in a more brief period of time. I need to be more efficient with my time. Or if it's a service I can't offer, and I let somebody else offer it who can offer it faster. But I will tell you that when you do the math on that, most of the time, those services are going to be generating more than that revenue.
Gotcha. I have a question personally. Do you have a good formula for chair cost, calculating chair cost?
They're not any better than you can find if you Google chair cost analysis. I mean, the biggest thing that is do you have a historical practice, or are you starting a new practice? And so, no, I would just add all those same things up that you'd normally add up and come up with the answer. So no, there's not an easy way to do it. That's why revenue per OD hour, if I already have figured out that my chair costs work at my current revenue per OD hour, then all I have to do is, if I want to add a new service, figure out if it's going to generate more or less than that revenue per OD hour. And if I've purchased things appropriately, like I've hit everybody up for the deal for eye care tonometry, which everybody should do, all 462 of you right now should do that. If I've done that well and I've purchased things well, then I know all the other stuff will follow, because my cost of goods will be in line. All my other business metrics will be in line. You know what I mean?
Yep. Last question. Clinically speaking, someone asked if your preference when looking at an angle is Goldman 3 mirror or OCT anterior segment.
No, so I think you can make the case for doing an anterior segment OCT, especially with lighting, but our gold standard is Goldman. And really you should be very comfortable doing Goldman. I mean, I'm going to get on a soapbox here, but I always encourage people, if you're not comfortable to do Goldman, do more Goldman. So do it on patients that you don't really even need it just to get practice. You don't have to bill it, just do it. And I will tell you that in Nebraska, we're right now battling a scope of practice enhancement. We're in what's called a 407 process. Bear with me. And the ophthalmologist who was testifying against us specifically for SLTs was trying to make the case that optometrists don't do gonioscopy enough to be proficient, so we can't do Goldman. Well, I will tell you that that if you look at our clinical practice guidelines, our ocular hypertensive patients and our open angle glaucoma patients, they recommend we do gonioscopy. Did I say Goldman? I meant to say that we're not proficient at doing gonioscopy. And our clinical practice guidelines recommend doing gonioscopy on every year for our ocular hypertensives, our glaucoma suspects, and our open angle patients. So you might do it more frequently than that, but the bottom line is do more gonioscopy. I think you get so much more information that way, but you can make the case that your anterior segment OCTs could be good because you may be able to see a little bit more about the specific angle of that. You're not going to be able to see which structures that you're concerned about. But I think you could also make the case that, on that measurement, maybe we're using less light, so we're not going to constrict the pupil as much and pull the iris out of the angle. So I think there's a case to be made, but gonioscopy is our gold standard. We should be doing more gonioscopy. Off the soapbox.
Great points. Thanks. I think that's it for Q&A.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks, you,
guys.
Chris,
Thanks so much for allowing me the time to talk to everybody and providing me this platform. You guys do a great job. I did show the picture of the podcast. Aaron's been on the podcast. If you like interesting conversations, it's why I think the way I think is because I talk to people who are way smarter than me. And so check out the podcast. Thanks so much, guys, for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It is a fantastic podcast. I think your bandwidth cut out, so I had to put the slide up again. But yeah, just search it on podcast. Chris, what's the name of the podcast again? Is it iCode?
Yeah, you can find it under iCode Media and all of your favorite EYECODE media at all your favorite podcast apps.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again for coming on. Always a fantastic wealth of knowledge that you bring. And I think our audience has been very thankful for what they learned in the past 2 hours. So I want to send our appreciation to you again. All right. And then we have our raffle. We are at the end and it looks like we're going to end on time, 11:09. Chris, we did it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. So our raffle winner, let me pull this up real quick. I am getting sent the result for that. Is Lauren Baldus. Lauren Baldus, if you are in the audience, please email us admin@ODsonFinance.com. You got $100 to spend on Amazon. So once again, Lauren Baldus. And I do want to send a special thank you to our two sponsors today. They're what made this event possible. CSI Revenue Cycle Management, once again, kind of branded through ODsonFinance. Contact Rob, feel free to scan that QR code. And then Michael Relvis Insurance, if you're looking for disability or term life insurance, Michael is your guy. So scan that QR code, reach out to him. And thank you everyone for joining us on Sunday. I know it was a good part of your Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon. We appreciate you spending it with ODsonFinance. Special thanks to Chris Lopez for jumping in and moderating the questions. And Dat is helping out his fiance at her bridal shower, but he's still on and still helping out. So I appreciate that. And otherwise, we will have another event. Our next one is going to be in mid-July, and it's going to be a 4-part series on how to get off of managed vision care plans. So kind of going off of what Chris was talking about today, it's going to be a full blueprint on how to remove yourself. So that's going to be a 4-part event. We've been working hard on that one, been working for about 2 quarters on that program. So it's going to be great. So look out for that. Otherwise, we're all set here. It is 11:10. And yes, this will be available for later viewing. We will send an email out to everyone that is registered, and look for the CE certificates in about 3 to 4 weeks as well. All right. Have a great Sunday, everyone. And we'll see you at the next event. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.